Chatterbox 307, Setting Boundaries. Hello Anna, hi there everyone, and hello Andrew. Great to be back here with all of you for another Chatterbox episode. Now Andrew, what is our topic for today? Well, the topic for today's episode is setting boundaries. And we'll get into what that means exactly in just a moment. But essentially, in a nutshell, setting boundaries is all about making a set of rules or guidelines for your life so that you can live the life that you want to live. I think this will be a really interesting topic to talk about, actually. I'm very into setting boundaries in different areas of my life. And Andrew, why don't we kick off and start our main discussion topic for today? Sounds good to me. So Anna, why don't we start by breaking down exactly what we mean by setting boundaries? Because I think if people look this word boundary up in the dictionary, they will probably see that is a line that demarcates between two different places. So we could talk about the boundary lines between like Spain and France, for example, right? Or we could talk about a boundary between my property and your property. Maybe we'd have a fence as a boundary. That is the dictionary definition. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking more about personal or individual boundaries. And what does that exactly mean? That's a really good point. That boundaries might be something physical, like a physical line. But often when you hear this term, setting boundaries, we're talking about these limits that we give ourselves. Maybe it is a clear boundary. It is like a line that we won't cross or a limit that we don't want to cross in the personal space or in a professional space. So setting boundaries is giving limits to something. Maybe that's a relationship. Maybe you want to set boundaries in your relationship to make sure that a line isn't crossed. And everybody sets different types of boundaries, different types of limits. Everybody's comfortable with different things. So setting boundaries is about giving yourself limits or having limits in different areas of your life. Maybe personal spaces, relationships, career. So I guess we could talk about setting boundaries, limits, and I guess really those boundaries are based on your values, where they come from, the values that you have. Do you think that's a good definition, Andrew? Would you like to add anything to that maybe? Yeah, I think that's an excellent definition. I think we could use a metaphor or a visualization to help here. And you could think of maybe if you are maybe a dog owner, okay? So you have like a house with a backyard and you buy a new dog and you want to keep your dog in your backyard. So you build a fence and the fence helps to keep your dog from running away, right? So the fence acts as the boundary for your dog, keeps your dog inside, keeps your dog safe and happy, and keeps your family happy too, because your dog doesn't run away. Well, in the same vein, in our personal lives, in our professional lives, in our social lives, we can set up boundaries that protect ourselves, right? We can set rules for our life. We can say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this kind of relationship, or I'm not comfortable with this kind of work environment. So we set that hard rule for our life and we say to ourselves, Well, for me to be happy, I need to live my life within this boundary. And like you said, Anna, everybody has a different level of comfort with doing things right. Everybody has a different level of comfort with doing things right. Maybe some people would like to set boundaries about how they spend their time, and they would say, well, every night I want to go to bed at 10 p.m. because I really value getting a good night's sleep, and that is something that is super important for my life. So they set that kind of time boundary in their life. Whereas other people might be more flexible, and they will say, I don't really need to sleep so much, or my life is flexible and I can go sleep at 2 a.m. one night and 1 a.m. the next night and 9:30 p.m. the next night. They have that flexibility, so we can set boundaries for so many different areas of our lives. And Anna, you mentioned a few of them there. We talked about time boundaries. We talked about career boundaries. There's boundaries that you could set up about how you want to spend your emotional energy. And maybe that's one that we should break down a little bit as well. And if we are talking about like an emotional boundary or an energy boundary, what kind of boundary would that be? So for me, emotional energy and putting boundaries on that is about who you are spending your time with. Because we've all got that people, right guys? There's these people that really boost your energy and you love being around them. And there's also people that suck your energy, and this isn't about being an introvert or an extrovert or anything like this. There's people that really suck our energy. Maybe they make us feel bad. I'm thinking about one person in particular, for example, that I've had in my past. And they kind of zap your emotional energy. So putting boundaries there and saying, okay, I'm not going to let this person zap my energy. Maybe that means spending less time with them. Maybe that means spending time with them in a different way. So I think it's about choosing really carefully. I think it's about choosing really carefully who you have around you in your life and who brings energy to you and who takes it away. And I guess it's really about managing toxic people that might be in your life. Toxic people or toxic things would be what I'm thinking about with emotional energy. Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. And Anna, you could also have boundaries that are based around maybe your personal morals or your ethics or your religious beliefs, right? Depending on the philosophy. Depending on the philosophy that you use to guide your life, you might want to set up different boundaries around that. And of course, that's going to vary drastically from person to person to person. But those are some major kind of boundaries that people set. And also there are social media boundaries as well, which is kind of a newer form of a boundary. But it's one that I try to do. I try to set some boundaries around social media. It's one that I try to do. 내가 하고 있는 거야. It's one that I try to do. 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 In my life, for example, I have some applications installed on my computer and on my phone. I have some applications. I have some applications installed on my computer and on my phone that limits how much time I can spend on certain social media sites like Instagram and Reddit, just because they are very addictive and I'm addicted to them. So those help me to set some boundaries. Why don't we talk about some of the boundaries that we have in our lives, Anna? I think maybe jumping into some examples would be a really clear way to illustrate what we are meaning when we talk about the setting boundaries. One of the main boundaries that I have, and I'm going to start with the social media, because that's what we are talking about here. You mentioned the kind of managing the time that you use it. So one thing for me, that's a boundary that I set on social media is how much I share about my private life. So for example, you mentioned the kind of managing the time that you use it. So one thing for me, that's a boundary that I set on social media is how much I share about my private life, for example. So there's the things that I'm happy to share on social media. They're the things that I'm happy to share on social media. So there's the things that I'm happy to share on social media. I am generally quite a private person. I'm generally quite a private person. I'm generally quite a private person. I only have a business account on social media. I don't have any personal social media account. So on my business professional account, I share a limited amount of personal information that I feel comfortable with. But there is a line that I won't cross. There is a line that I won't cross. For example, I won't share things about where I am, location. That's an obvious one, right? And there's elements about my family and my friends that I feel that are not for me, and not that it's not appropriate for me. It's crossing a boundary, and I want to keep it professional. I want to keep it focused on the work that I do. So that for me is setting a boundary between this is my professional account and this is my personal life. So that's a really important boundary for me to set. And for me, actually, Andrew, a lot of these things about setting boundaries is about this personal, private, especially when it's to do with the social media. And I think setting boundaries is a lot about relationships and people. Actually, for me, I remember I had one friend. Unfortunately, they are not a friend anymore. I wouldn't consider them a friend now. You know, when you get that feeling and you just know when somebody's crossed a boundary, they've done something and you just think you've gone too far. You've crossed the line, and if you accept that behavior, it sets a precedent, and it means that they feel comfortable treating you like that again in the future. So for me, it's really important to nip that sort of thing in the bud. and say, this is not a person that I want in my life anymore. I'm going to set the boundary for myself and I'm going to move on. I'm not going to cause a fuss. I'm not going to cause a fuss. I'm not going to cause a fuss. I'm not going to have an argument with them or whatever. But I'm just going to take this decision and say, I don't think that this person is a good person to have in my life, and so I'm not going to have them in my life. Setting boundaries for me is really about relationships. The people that you have around you. What behaviors are you going to accept, and what are you not going to accept, and nipping the things in the bud that you don't like. By the way, guys, nipping something in the bud is a beautiful phrase. I love this one, and it basically means to try and sort out the problem before it gets any worse. Yeah, to solve the problem as soon as you can, as soon as you notice the problem, to try your best to take care of it, right? To try your best to take care of it, right? And that's a great example of nipping something in the bud, which is spelled B-U-D. By the way, bud, before it blows up and explodes, right? So if you do have that kind of interpersonal issue, interpersonal issue, 인간관계 문제, 대인관계에 관련된 문제. Interpersonal issue. Interpersonal. If you do have that kind of interpersonal issue, interpersonal. Interpersonal issue. If you do have that kind of interpersonal issue with another person, maybe a person or an acquaintance, and you feel like they are just not respecting you, or maybe draining you of your emotional energy, or any of the things that we've been talking about, then you could try and solve that problem by nipping it in the bud. And maybe removing that person from your life before that person causes you a lot of grief. And you were talking about how you try to keep your personal life away from social media. And I'm wondering if you've ever had this happen to you, because it's happened to me before, and I realized that because of this, I needed to create a boundary in my life around it, and that is people just posting anything they like on social media without asking permission. without asking permission. And I actually had to set this boundary with my wife, believe it or not, because she's too much open to sharing about her life on social media than I am in my life. So I'm maybe not as strict as you about social media, Anna. Because I do have my own personal social media account, but it's restricted onto my friends. It's restricted only to 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 my friends. It's restricted. 친구들한테만 공개가 돼 있어. 친구들만 볼 수 있어. It's restricted only to my friends. It's restricted only to my friends. It's restricted only to my friends, so it's not open. It's not open. So it's not open. And I really only have a small amount of followers. And I really only have a small amount of followers. A small amount of. I really only have a small amount of followers. And I really only have a small amount of followers. And I really only have a small amount of followers. And I really only have a small amount of followers, who are all people I know well. They are my friends, they are my family, and I don't just share details about my private life on the internet. I don't just share details about my private life on the internet. I don't just share details about my private life on the internet. Like you, of course, I have the clips in Instagram, and I have, different things like that. But I try not to share too much. I try not to share too many personal details. I try not to share too many. I try not to share too many personal details. I try not to share too many personal details. I try not to share too many personal details. I try not to share too many personal details. It just makes me feel uncomfortable to do that on the internet. But my wife, when we first met, she was very happy to just post any pictures online. And especially, she would not always, but I remember one instance. She just posted a photo where I didn't look very good. I was making like a funny face, and and she thought it was cute, and I guess it was cute. Maybe I overreacted, but I was like, could you take that down? Like, do we have to put that picture online? Like, really, So I felt like she kind of crossed the line, and I had to set that boundary, like, okay, if you want to post a picture on social media, at least just ask me first. That's my rule, right? I'm curious. I'm curious, has that ever happened to you? Has somebody posted your picture on social media without asking first? Well, here's the thing. I'm a bit of a professional at this because the way that you can avoid that situation is just not letting people take pictures of you, which is what I do. So essentially, there's no pictures that exist yet. There's no picture that exists of me. There's no picture that exists of me. There's no picture that exists. There's no picture that exists of me. Exists of me. There's no pictures that exist. Exist. There's no pictures that exist of me. Exist. There's no pictures that exist of me that I have not taken. Therefore, I run no risk of a rogue picture being uploaded on Instagram. And like you said, everybody has different levels. Like some people might find it strange that I don't have a personal social media, and it's just a personal choice. It's not kind of I'm not punishing myself or anything. I just prefer to do that. And another example I thought I'd share in a professional context, because it's also in a professional context as well. I work with different clients. And Andrew, I know that you work with the students where I'm sure you have to set boundaries about things like homework and being on time. And maybe you're listening at home. Maybe you're thinking, at work. I have to set some boundaries with my boss, maybe or with my team. Well, one thing for me, and this is a really good example of this, is about cancellations. So I have different clients that I work with, and you have to set a really clear boundary that if you cancel the session before a specific time period, then the session is going to be counted as taken. The session is going to be counted as taken. And this is actually really hard. And one thing I did want to say, Andrew, is that it is hard to set boundaries. I'm not saying that it's easy, especially when they are personal relationships or people that you like. And one thing when you're working with clients is you've got to have a very business hat on. 집중이 안 되지. And one thing when you're working with the clients is you've got to have a very business hat on, because even though sometimes you feel bad because you're like it's a late cancellation. I feel really bad, but I have to make sure that I do this because otherwise it sets a precedent. And I'm going to come back to that phrase because I used that one before. And to set a precedent, it could be a bad precedent or a good one, but normally we use it in a bad context. Again, it comes back to that thing of if I let you do this now, you're gonna do it again in the future, and that's not okay. So you have to set that boundary. Make sure it's really clear. If you cancel the session before a specific time, I'm going to count the session as taken. I'm really sorry, but that's the way it works, and you have to be quite cold and neutral about it. But I do find that hard sometimes. Sometimes I feel bad, but that's the name of the game. There are the rules, there are the conditions, and it's very important to do that, because otherwise people will walk all over you. They really will. Not everyone, but you do have to be careful. You have to protect yourself sometimes, especially in a professional context also as well.